Final Fantasy II. This has always been considered the black sheep of the franchise. Since its release, it's been primarily panned by audiences as one of the worst games in the series. However, despite its very poor reputation, it's had numerous ports and remasters and remakes over the years, all that aim to make Final Fantasy II a much more enjoyable experience, from the visuals all the way to the updated UI and gameplay. In my last review, I took a look at Final Fantasy I. Even with its outdated mechanics and gameplay, I still think that it's definitely a worthwhile experience to play through the original game today, especially with the updated audio, visual, and mechanical overhaul of the Pixel Remasters. But does Final Fantasy II hold up in the same way? I hope that I can help answer that question for you. So without further ado, let's talk about my experience with Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II was released in Japan on December 17th in 1988 on the Famicom, also known as the NES, almost an exact year to the date that Final Fantasy I released. It didn't make its way into the US until April 8th of 2003 on the PlayStation 1 in the Final Fantasy Origins collection. Not to be confused with the 2022 Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. Totally different game. By the time Final Fantasy II finally came to the US, Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts had already released worldwide, and Final Fantasy XI was just released on the PlayStation 2 in Japan. That's how long it took for the US to finally get the original Final Fantasy II. Now, the US did get a Final Fantasy II, but it was actually Final Fantasy IV for the Super Nintendo, and that's a completely different discussion for a future video. So after the success of Final Fantasy I, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the director of the game, knew that he wanted to make the sequel something entirely different from the first game. New story, new characters, a whole new world, etc. This is a tradition that would continue in the Final Fantasy franchise to this day. You can see back there, I do have the Final Fantasy Ultimania, and in the first volume that includes some tidbits about Final Fantasy II, there's actually a few pages that are completely dedicated to the original concept of Final Fantasy II. And back whenever they were originally writing the script, the entire plot, the whole scenario, everything was a completely different video game. The plot would have revolved around this succession of these warring kingdoms, and you would have been able to make decisions that would have changed the outcome of the ending. It kind of blew my mind. It's pretty wild. I really hope that one day we do see some sort of revival in some way of this original Final Fantasy II prototype story. And one of the reasons why it was changed was honestly due to the success of Dragon Quest III. Dragon Quest III was incredibly successful, and it released right at the beginning planning stages of Final Fantasy II. The whole team was heavily pushed to shift their entire gameplay and progression system in order to allow players to level up their skills on an individual level and allow more customization in their party, similarly to Dragon Quest III. And on top of all of that, Hironobu at this time was deeply inspired after watching Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. He grew this incredibly strong desire to tell a story about young rebels fighting against a dark emperor, harboring ships and weapons designed to destroy the world. I mean, just that alone, you can clearly see he was inspired by Star Wars. So the team ultimately opted to scrap that entire original plot that they had with the warring kingdoms and the succession in favor of writing the Star Wars-esque rebel army story that Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted to tell. One of the largest developmental differences between Final Fantasy I and II was that in the first game, the gameplay was the baseline for the entire game, and the story was written afterwards. In Final Fantasy II, they decided to work the opposite way around and develop the story first and develop gameplay that followed suit with the story. Several of the core Final Fantasy team came back for Final Fantasy II. Hironobu Sakaguchi again created the plot for the title, with the actual scenario written by Kenji Terada. Nobuo Uematsu was back composing the music, while Yoshitaka Amano was again the concept artist. Like I said said with Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 2 had tons and tons of re-releases over the years. Some with visual differences, some with audio differences, some with gameplay tweaks. There's a myriad of ways to play through Final Fantasy 2. For my last review of Final Fantasy 1, I decided to play through the Pixel Remaster. It's not a perfect game, it's not a perfect port, but I really appreciated everything that it tried to do. One of my praises for the entire Pixel Remaster series is the soundtrack. All of the updated music that Nobuo Uematsu oversaw for these remasters has been wonderful. By far, my favorite thing about all of these Pixel Remasters. Although one of the things that I'm kind of flip-flopped on when it comes to these Pixel Remasters is the visual representation. I think the pixel art looks really good. I don't think that it's bad pixel art, and I really appreciate that they're kind of going that direction of being as close to that original NES and Super Nintendo style that they can get it while being HD. I think that's all really cool. But personally, when it comes to Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 2, I am kind of more of a fan of the PSP versions. It's honestly just a personal preference for me. I'm not saying that these visuals are by far the best and you're wrong for preferring to look at a different version of the game. Not at all. It's just something that I personally prefer. Although another thing that I did not like that these Pixel Remasters did was the removal of a lot of the extra content that was included in the Game Boy Advance and the PSP versions of these games. You're still getting the original plot, you're not really missing out on too much, but it's just little stuff like dialogue, jobs, dungeons, enemies, weapons, a little bit of extra story content that wasn't in the original games. Like I said, you're not missing out on a whole lot, but nonetheless, it's extra content that I personally wish that I could have got in the Pixel Remasters. Anyways, I basically just say all of that because I wanted to let you guys know that for this review, I kind of decided that I wanted to give myself the best of both worlds, if you will. So for this review, I played through the PSP version of Final Fantasy II, but it's modded with the soundtrack of the Pixel Remasters. Obviously, when it comes to the Final Fantasy franchise, so many of these games have different versions that you can play, and realistically, I mean, as long as you're playing a Final Fantasy game, you're probably going to have a great time. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a best version of Final Fantasy, but with modding, you can come close. This is just what I think is the best version for me personally, but if you are a NES purist or a Game Boy Advance Dawn of Souls purist, that's totally fine. Also in this review, because I am playing the PSP version, there is a post-game story that takes place during the finale of the main storyline, but kind of gives a different perspective on it. It's called Soul of Rebirth, and I will give my thoughts and review on Soul of Rebirth towards the end of this video, so if you want to know that little extra story bit that's exclusive to the Game Boy Advance and PSP version, I will talk about that later on. But without further ado, let's talk about Final Fantasy II proper with the good. Now, I've said it once, I've said it twice, I've said it 3 times, I'll say it a million more times. The soundtracks, the soundtracks, the soundtracks, the music in all of these games. Just full disclosure here, I mean, I'll talk about the soundtracks in every one of these Final Fantasy reviews, but there's not a single soundtrack that I dislike. There are some that I like more than others, but if I were to rank the soundtracks, it would be from the best to the least best, because they're all awesome. They're all fantastic. Nobuo Uematsu has done incredible work since day one with the Final Fantasy series. And I'm not just talking about with the Pixel Remasters, I'm also talking about just these original OSTs. If you take a listen to these original songs as they were on the NES, and even comparing them to the updated Pixel Remaster, or even, you know, the PSP reworkings, they all just sound fantastic. I'll say it a million times, the music in these games is phenomenal. So obviously the music is going to be a pro for the Final Fantasy series for me, so let's go ahead and really just talk about the game itself. And just real fast, I mean, my experience overall was really positive. I had a very good experience playing through Final Fantasy II again today. And to be honest, I mean, I really wasn't expecting to like it as much as I would. It's pretty much in everyone's list, including my own, really, really low on just ranking the Final Fantasy games. When I played it back in 2010 on the Game Boy Advance, I really wasn't too impressed with it. I played it right after I played Final Fantasy I, and I decided that I would skip Final Fantasy III afterwards because I didn't really want to continue going through it in release order, because Final Fantasy II just kind of left this weird taste in my mouth with the gameplay, the password system, and all this stuff. It was just a bunch of competing factors that really didn't leave a great impression on me. But I will say, I'll reiterate again, this experience overall, with the way that I was able to play it, I had a much more enjoyable time. And I think a lot of that might actually have to do with the fact that I've played just about every other Final Fantasy game. Not every single one, but I've played almost all of them. And I think having a better appreciation for the series and knowing the roots a little bit better and doing more history and research just like on all of this stuff, I really think that kind of helped motivate my passion and my liking for Final Fantasy II. And this time around, one of my positives is actually the plot of this game. I actually think it's a pretty decent plot. It's nothing crazy complex, but it's well told, and I think it's pretty engaging, especially with all of these updated versions of the game that have script tweaks and just translation fixes. I think the story, the narrative overall is pretty good. The game centers around a conflict by the Palamecian Empire, whose emperor is using Hellspawn to try to conquer the world. The protagonist, Firion, along with his allies, Maria and Guy, join the Wild Rose Rebellion to fight them and meet many allies along the way to try to stop the Emperor and save the world. It's simple, it's familiar, but I think it's a plot structure that lends really well to developing proper character arcs. I think with having a rebel army, you can kind of create this sense of loss and turmoil with your characters and really try to make it feel like the player understands what these characters are going through, how high the stakes are, and honestly, like I said, I think that it's a pretty solid plot overall from beginning to end, especially with the Soul of Rebirth, a little side story, which we'll talk about later. But speaking of character arcs, that is another thing that this game does pretty well, sometimes not so well in other times, but overall, especially compared to Final Fantasy I, this game has characters, and they have, I mean, some of them, like I said, they have really good development in some cases. So that's another really good positive that I have for this game, is just the character development, the fact that it's even just present here, and the fact that it was not in Final Fantasy I whatsoever. That's a plus in my book. First, we have Firion, who is the main character. He's the adopted friend of Maria and Leon and the childhood friend of Guy. He's also seeking to destroy the Empire to avenge his dead family. Then there's Maria, who is Firion and Guy's childhood friend and the lead heroine. She's out on a quest to find her brother Leon. Then there's Guy, who is raised by wild animals before being taken in by Maria and Leon's parents. His grasp of the human language is very limited, but he can talk to wild animals. And lastly, there's Leon, who is Maria's older brother, and he went missing during the attack on Finn. And spoiler alert, he is now acting as the Dark Knight for the Emperor. And on the topic of story spoilers, we actually have some characters here who die. We have quite a lot, actually. As you're playing through the game, you'll have a rotating cast of characters who fill in that fourth party member slot outside of just Firion, Maria, and Guy. Almost every person who appears in your party for a period of time, I don't think every single one of them does, but almost all of them die at some point. A character who actually doesn't even enter your party, Sid, at some point in the story, like I said, spoilers, he does die, and I'm not gonna lie, I mean, as far as character deaths go in an old school NES style story or anything like that, this definitely had some emotional weight to it. The way that he passes, the way that he describes, just lending you the ship, he's not feeling well, he's gonna lay down, and he says, you can use my ship, but I'm just lending it to you. Whenever you're done with it, whenever I'm back better, I want it back. And then he dies, It's kind of sad. And honestly, while I was playing through it, it's not like I shed tears or anything like that. It's nothing so crazy. It's, it's kind of a trope that's been done before. But nonetheless, just the way that it happens in this story and happening to an iconic character like Sid, I felt pretty emotional. It was kind of a sad moment for me. And on the topic of iconic Final Fantasy characters and Final Fantasy stuff, Final Fantasy II introduces a ton of the iconic staples that we will see throughout the franchise all the way up to this day. This is the first time that we get chocobos. Chocobos are these bird/horse hybrids that you can ride around, and I think one of the descriptions for chocobos describes them as being incredibly feared by all of the monsters on the land. So whenever you hop on them, they travel really fast, and you can travel around the entire world as long as there's land and you don't have to cross any water or anything like that. You can travel on a chocobo enemy free. You don't have to worry about any random encounters or anything like that. They are very fast. They are solely mobile, just on the land alone. They don't walk on the water or anything like that, or swim in the water. They don't fly. Some iterations of chocobos do change up that formula later in the series, but in this original version, they are just a fast, speedy, enemy-free, random encounter-free mode of transportation, and I like it. Final Fantasy 1 didn't really have that besides the airship, really, and that's, you're gearing towards the end of the game there, but here in Final Fantasy II, you can find a chocobo right out the gate. And, as before mentioned, Sid is a character who appears in just about every single Final Fantasy game, and this is really where he got his first story. This is where he got his first arc. The first time his name really appeared in a Final Fantasy game was Final Fantasy II. Now, if you've played some of the re-releases of the first Final Fantasy game, you will see his name mentioned by the Lufenian people, but that is a retcon. That was not in the original NES script, in the original Famicom script. Final Fantasy II, on the other hand, Sid, from day one, from the first release all the way up to now, he's always been in Final Fantasy II, and since then has become a staple for the whole series as the guy who's got the airship, he's got the ship, he's got the spaceship, he's the mechanic, he's just that kind of guy. He plays that sort of character in all these Final Fantasy games. It might change up here and there, if I remember correctly. I'm pretty sure he's mostly a mechanic type character, the ship operator. And it starts here, and I love that. This is also the first time that we see dragoons as a race of people, as a class. We have dragoons here in Final Fantasy II. Dragoons have been this culture, this race, like you had dragoons for a great period of time in the past, and at the point that the Emperor is ruling here, there's none. They've basically all been laid to waste, but through the course of playing the game and the story, you do come across one dragoon character, and this, he's really powerful, he's really strong, he's got a really, really cool design, and he's been kind of a staple of the Final Fantasy series ever since Final Fantasy II. And his last name is Highwind, which honestly is another Final Fantasy staple. Even if you played Kingdom Hearts, the Highwind is the name of the first gummy ship that you get the option to rename whenever you are playing the first Kingdom Hearts game. Highwind has just kind of become one of those staples in the Final Fantasy kind of multiverse, if you will, so it's cool to see Highwind appear in Final Fantasy II as well. Also, in the story, one of the main things that you are trying to attain in order to save the world, defeat the final boss, it's the Ultima magic. Ultima is definitely a Final Fantasy staple. It appears in, I think, in every single Final Fantasy game, some form of Ultima magic. And like I said, this is where you get it, and it's incredibly powerful, especially once you start leveling up that specific spell. Ultima is going to be your best friend. Another iconic thing that actually is kind of not in this game, but kind of is, That's the Moogles. There's actually no Moogles here in this game, but there are beavers, and the beavers in this game, these guys they're kind of that original concept of the Moogles. The Moogles didn't really appear until Final Fantasy III, but in Final Fantasy II, you do come across beavers. I'm pretty sure that you don't really see an actual race of beavers in other Final Fantasy games. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But here in Final Fantasy II, this was kind of that original concept of the Moogles, which didn't really appear until Final Fantasy III, but they're here in spirit. And the other thing that just kind of kept on rearing its head as I was playing through this game that I noticed almost every time that it happened, and it just kind of put a smile on my face every time it did happen, but that was any time that there was just such clear inspiration and reference taken from Star Wars, like the classic Star Wars. Obviously, like we said, this is very much so inspired by The Empire Strikes Back, and there are a bunch of scenes that really let you know that that's kind of where this story, that's where this, this whole plot was inspired from. And one scene that really stood out to me just when playing this game again, in this version in particular, there's the scene where you have the Dreadnought flying over the clouds, and right underneath it you see a small little airship. It's Cid's airship, and it's kind of this chase, it's this chase. The Dreadnought is trying to get Cid's airship, and it's really cool. The way it's all designed, the way the whole scene plays out, it's really interesting. I know that on the original NES version and in the Pixel Remaster version, you don't really get much of a scene with it. You kind of have this short little clip, you appear out onto the main field, and you see a big black ship, that's the Dreadnought, and you see a tiny little brown ship, and they kind of look similar sizes, and it doesn't really look something that's super cinematic. So with the PSP and the Game Boy Advance version, I'll put the footage on the screen right here, but you can see that they put a lot of attention to detail here. They really felt like this was a scene that was worth just giving a whole scene to, taking up an entire, couple of seconds just to animate them going through the sky and the clouds and stuff. It just looks really good, and every time I've watched it over and over again, it really does remind me of Star Wars. And not only just that, but this whole plot with the Dreadnought and breaking into the Dreadnought and blowing it up, completely destroying it. It's very, very reminiscent to like the Death Star or something from Star Wars. So I had a lot of good things to say about the game, and overall, like I said, this was a fairly positive experience. But like all games, this game is not perfect, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the stuff that I was mixed on. Some stuff that I was kind of all over the place, emotionally when it came to some of this stuff. And really the biggest thing here that I flip-flop on all the time is the main gameplay loop. And I'll actually go as far as to just say that I did not hate it in any regard. In fact, I probably liked it a lot more than I disliked it. So Final Fantasy II eliminates the leveling system from Final Fantasy I. It focuses on the playable character's individual stats, which increase according to how much they are used or required. For example, a character who frequently casts magic would have their magic proficiency increase faster, while a character who frequently takes damage would have their maximum hit points increased. If you want a character to become more proficient with a certain type of weapon, whether that be an axe or a sword or just their bare fist or even just using a shield, you have to have those things equipped onto you, and you gotta use those weapons and use that shield, use your fists and stuff. You gotta use it pretty often. If you want a spell like magic and fire and blizzard to level up more and become more powerful versions of those spells, you just have to use them more and more and more. There is no Fyra or Fyraga or Blizzara or Blizzaga or anything like that. You just have fire, blizzard, thunder, and as you are using those magic abilities, they become stronger over time as you just use them and you become more proficient with them. It's kind of similar to really learning any skill or getting better at any sort of talent or any sort of proficiency with anything you want to get better at. It's just that repetition, that practice. I understand where they're coming from whenever they are designing this system. Of course, you're going to be better at using a sword by using a sword more often, you don't just pick up a sword and you're just a master swordsmith. Same thing with fighting, bare knuckles. If you want to become incredibly proficient with fighting bare knuckles, you gotta fight bare knuckles a lot, and as you do that, you get better. So your individual stats are basically fully dependent on whether or not you want them to change based on how you play the game. I think it's a positive because I think just conceptually it makes sense, right? But at the same time, when you go from something so simplistic, like just the general leveling up system from Final Fantasy 1 that continues in many other Final Fantasy games and most RPGs in general, going from that to this, it's kind of, it's maybe culture shock is the right word. It's just something that you're not really prepared for. It's a whole new gameplay system, whole new mechanic that you have to work with. Final Fantasy 1 had the magic system that was kind of taken from D&D using spell slots, whereas from here on out, we're pretty much exclusively using MP as a magic system. So, you know, if you're used to something like Final Fantasy 1 and you liked that and you jump into Final Fantasy 2, you're probably not going to like it the first time around. That's kind of how I was after I played Final Fantasy 1. I was so used to just the way that that game played, and coming into Final Fantasy 2 and expecting a lot more from me. It's just not something that I really wanted to do at that time, I guess. But now that I've kind of gone back, played this game again, it's a good game. I really think that the gameplay system is pretty intuitive. Honestly, I would say that as far as gameplay goes, if you are looking for the most user-friendly, the most player-friendly way to play through this game and gain levels in a way that is most friendly to the player, I would go ahead and play the Pixel Remaster. They just have a few tweaks here and there that have really made the gameplay a lot more smooth, making a lot of just a ton more fun, if I'm being totally honest. And it kind of eliminates a lot of that grinding that you might feel like you have to do with older releases like the Game Boy, PlayStation 1 version, PSP version. I would say from a gameplay stance alone, stick with the Pixel Remaster. But now let's move on to the stuff that I really did not like about the game, and there's only a few things. Like I said, guys, this was a fairly positive experience for me. So let's talk about the bad, and that is, first and foremost, the password system. And it's not even necessarily that I think that the idea is bad. In fact, I think something like an MMO or even just a modern Final Fantasy game or any other sort of RPG, a password system where you, from talking to NPCs or talking to just, you know, people in the world, getting certain key phrases and words and information from them, I think can be implemented to something that's really interesting nowadays. Now that games are just a little bit more complex, you have more worlds, you have more areas to explore, more people to talk to and interact, more things to miss, things like that. Just it kind of allows for a lot of optional content that can be unlocked, and I think that it might work today. But in Final Fantasy 2, it's just a nuisance. It's just tedious and it's unnecessary, because how it works in the game is you'll talk to somebody who will say a word that's highlighted in green or highlighted in red. You know, it's very clearly, it's a it's a highlighted word. And then as soon as they say something, you have the option to learn that word or ask about any of the words that you've learned. And sometimes characters have answers for you. Sometimes they just have a little question mark. And it's just one of those things where it's like, why can't I just talk to them? Why can't I just select the talk button, you know, press A or whatever on them, and then just give me the useful information that I need? Instead, they want me to siphon through all of these different words that I've learned just to ask them some question about a piece of information that I didn't even think was going to be super useful, but apparently I needed to learn it. I don't know, it's just unnecessary. Like I said, I think that it's something that can be implemented in unique ways nowadays, but in Final Fantasy II, no matter which version you're playing, it's just a gimmick. It's not useful. It's actually kind of unhelpful. It just adds more playtime because you're sitting there just in menus. A lot of trial and error conversations, so wasn't a fan of that. And the other thing that I just could not stand about this game was the overall dungeon design. In Final Fantasy 1, you had dungeons, you had lots of rooms. Sometimes rooms would have treasure chests, sometimes they wouldn't. But for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. You're going down into the dungeon till finally you reach the end of the dungeon. You do the thing that you need to do, that's it. That's kind of just the straightforward dungeon design of Final Fantasy 1. It's nothing too complicated. It's just complex enough to give you some challenge, you know. You gotta stock up on materials going down there. In Final Fantasy 2, on the other hand, these dungeons are full. Some of them are just so chock full of doors that lead to nowhere. You'll open up a door and there will just be nothing in there, but every step that you take inside that room has an incredibly high encounter rate. Like asininely high. Like it's terrible just how high the encounter rate is in here. And there are tons of these doors that you can walk into in all of these dungeons, and so many of them lead to absolutely nowhere and instead just bring on a bunch of enemies that you did not even want to fight. You'll find yourself fleeing from so many battles in this game just because the encounter rate when you step into these rooms and the rate at which you encounter these fake rooms, it's so unnecessarily high. It's ridiculous. It makes you just, like, you walk up to a dungeon, you walk into a castle, you just know, like, oh god, here's another dungeon. I don't even want to explore it because there's all these doors. Like, I don't want to walk into any doors. I'm only going somewhere if it's a staircase. I don't want to walk into any doors. It's just legitimately something that really dampened my experience with the game, and the only thing that I can say in regards to that is if you are going to play this game, no matter which version, make sure you have some form of map ready, because you don't want to walk into these rooms. You just don't want to walk into these rooms. They suck. And then another thing that I felt a little weird about, and it's one of those things that I don't necessarily want to feel so negatively about them, because I love Yoshitaka Amano. He's one of my favorite artists of all time. He's done wonders for the Final Fantasy series. I highly, highly, highly respect the dude. But this is kind of an exclusive Game Boy Advance and PSP issue that I really have here. And it's mainly just that whenever you're talking to people and they have their little portrait up top, sometimes they look really good, and sometimes they look god awful, and I hate them. And I never want to look at them. They're so bad. I'm honestly mainly talking about Paul. Like, you talk to that guy and you're just like, what? What happened, man? Get some help. But that's overall my thoughts and feelings of the base game of Final Fantasy II. Much more enjoyable than I was anticipating. You know, I don't think it's up there with the greats. It's a good game for what it is, though, and I liked that I was able to play it again, and I liked that I was able to play it kind of the way that I wanted to play it, with the visual aesthetics and the extra content that comes with the PSP version, but the audio quality and the beautiful soundtrack that comes with the Pixel Remaster. But speaking of extra content that comes in this Game Boy Advance and PSP version, let's talk about Soul of Rebirth. This is an extra story, like just little episode that is unlockable after you've finished the main game, and as soon as you finish it, you can start it up, and it takes place during the final act of Final Fantasy II. In the story of Final Fantasy II, Minwu sacrifices himself in order to grant the Ultima weapon to the main cast of Final Fantasy II. This extra episode picks up exactly at that moment when Minwu dies, and he wakes up essentially in the afterlife. And after exploring a little bit, Minwu then meets up with Gordon, Joseph, and Rykard. All of these characters were at some point a part of the main party in the base game. They all died in one way or another, so in this story, you are essentially a band of 4 people who died and are now trying to make your way out of the afterlife and figure out what's going on. And I've got one big positive and one big negative that I have for this little episode here. So my big positive here is the story. I think that this is actually very well told, and given the character development that we've gotten for these specific characters in the base game, I think that this little episode does a much better job at giving them more characterization, making you care a little bit more about their efforts and their sacrifices and stuff like that. I really like the characterization here. So overall, I think that the plot to this little story is really well done, and the way it wraps up and the way it kind of coincides with the real finale of Final Fantasy II, I don't think it does anything too crazy, but I'm glad that it gives a little bit of extra closure to people who maybe really liked those characters back in the day and just kind of wanted to see a little bit more of them. And yeah, overall, the plot to this little episode is really good. On the flip side of that, These are characters that you had in your party beforehand, and one thing that the game does is it keeps track of how you used your party members. So if you had these party members in Final Fantasy II and you kind of knew that they were gonna die, or you didn't really like using them, or they were just underleveled and they weren't really the kind of party member that you were looking for, and you kind of put them off to the wayside, you made a terrible decision. If you're planning on playing Soul of Rebirth, you're gonna wanna kind of grind up these characters a little bit, especially just starting off, because these characters, their starting stats are the same stats that they died with in the story. So whenever you pick them up, if they were really underleveled, you're gonna have to do some pretty serious grinding. You're gonna have to, like, you know, if you're playing on an emulator or something, you're gonna have to do lots of save states because you're probably gonna die a lot. It's not very easy, especially in the very beginning. And the final boss is tough. It's not very easy. So that's kind of my big gripe here, is I really wasn't expecting to have to go and, you know, bring back these characters and all of their stats just how they were whenever they died. But, you know, it kind of makes sense. It's using that save data of your cleared game of the base game. So I understand what they were going for, but wow, was it frustrating in the beginning stages of this little episode. However, guys, that is my review of Final Fantasy II. It was a lot better than I expected. I really was not thinking that I was going to go into this game and come out liking the game a lot more than I originally did. But let me know down in the comments below. Have you played Final Fantasy II? Do you want to play Final Fantasy II? Is it one that you're gonna skip? Have you tried it before and maybe you wanna check it out again? Go ahead and let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, click the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell as well so that you're notified whenever I upload new videos, and it helps the algorithm a lot. And I'm trying to do, you know, maybe some Final Fantasy reviews full time, I don't know. Also, while you're down there, go ahead and join the Discord. There is a link to join the Discord. There's a bunch of like-minded individuals in there that you'll probably get along with. I love everyone in that Discord. Thank you to everyone who has joined the Discord. If you want to talk about Final Fantasy, go ahead and join it. If you want to talk about any other sort of RPG, Kingdom Hearts is also a big thing of mine as well. So if you want to talk about Kingdom Hearts, join the Discord. If you want to talk about literally anything, if you want to confide your secrets to me, you can. Also, down in the description box, you will find a link to the Patreon. It's not required whatsoever. It's really just a way for you to tell me that you like what I'm doing and that you would love to support me monetarily. There's a few perks that are available right now, and I'm doing my best to make sure that I can get all those perks out to the people who are paying for them. So go ahead in the description below if you want to take a look at the Patreon perks. I'll maybe make an updated video on that sort of stuff sometime down the line. And of course, the more people who join, the more people who subscribe, and the more attention this channel gets and these videos gets, that's going to be kind of where the ball really starts rolling for really good Patreon stuff. However, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.